The set buzzed with movement, cameras rolling, lights shifting, whispers rippling through the crew. It should have been just another day, another scene, another take. But today, something felt different. Something was off. Sandra Bullock sensed it the moment she stepped onto the set. The air was thick with tension, a heavy weight that coiled around her chest and refused to let go. And at the center of it all stood John Hargrove, a director revered for his brilliance but infamous for his ruthlessness. As the cameras rolled, the pressure mounted. The sharp remarks, the quiet humiliations, the carefully placed jabs designed to break her, Hargrove wielded them all with precision. Then, just as he prepared to tear her down again, the door swung open. Keanu Reeves had arrived. He took one look at the scene unfolding before him and understood everything. Because today, the real battle wouldn't play out on camera. It would happen behind the scenes. And by the time the day was over, someone would lose everything. The set moved like a well-oiled machine, lights adjusted, cameras found their marks, last-minute script changes were whispered between crew members. Sandra Bullock stood before the mirror in her trailer, taking a deep breath. Today would be tough. She had faced challenging roles before, built her career on emotionally raw performances, but something about this day felt heavier. Was it the intensity of the scene? Or was it the man calling the shots? John Hargrove. A perfectionist. A visionary. A director with no tolerance for anything less than his impossibly high standards. Stepping onto the set, Sandra immediately felt the weight of the moment. The scene they were about to film was a defining one, pain, resilience, everything her character had endured condensed into a single moment. She knew what needed to be done. The cameras were ready. The crew stood poised, waiting for the cue. Action. Sandra dove in, her voice raw, her emotions pouring into every word. The weight of her performance filled the air, lingering even after her final line. Silence. Then, John's voice sliced through it. Cut. Sandra let out a slow breath, waiting for feedback. A note, an adjustment, something constructive. Instead, John chuckled. Low. Dismissive. That's it, he scoffed. The crew stiffened. John stood from his chair, pacing forward. Sandra turned to face him, her heart pounding. She had worked with tough directors before, but Hargrove had a way of cutting straight to the bone. Let's do it again, he said, his voice sharper now. And this time, act like you care. Sandra's stomach twisted. Criticism she could handle, this industry was built on it. But the way he said it, loud enough for everyone to hear, drenched in condescension, it was calculated. A move meant to belittle. She curled her fingers into fists at her sides, hidden from view. She wouldn't react. Wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The cameras rolled again. This time, she pushed harder, poured more into the scene. She knew it was good, she could feel it. But the moment the last word left her lips, John was on his feet again. Wow, he drawled, loud enough for the entire set to hear. Has our star finally lost her shine? A few chuckles rippled through the crew. Most remained silent, avoiding eye contact. Sandra felt it then, that sharp sting, that familiar ache. It wasn't just the insult itself. It was the way he said it. A challenge. A test. And the worst part? He wanted her to break. Sandra held her ground, refusing to let the cracks show. But deep inside, something shifted. Whether it was rage or doubt, she couldn't tell. One thing was certain, this wasn't about a bad take. This was about respect. And as silence settled over the set, one thought pressed into her mind. Was she the only one who felt this way? The set remained eerily quiet. Sandra Bullock stood firm, but humiliation burned beneath the surface. She had endured difficult directors before, relentless demands, impossible expectations, but there was a fine line between pushing an actor toward greatness and publicly tearing them down. And John Hargrove? He had no interest in the distinction. Exhaling slowly, she kept her face neutral. She wouldn't let him see that his words had hit their mark. But as she glanced around the room, she noticed something. Everyone had heard him. Some crew members kept their heads down, eyes locked on their work. Others shifted, uneasy. And a few, those who had been around Hargrove long enough, smirked, as if this was just another day, another victim. Because John Hargrove wasn't just a perfectionist. He was a bully. And no one, not a single person, stood up to him. Sandra clenched her jaw, pushing back the lump in her throat. She wasn't a rookie. She had worked with the best in the industry, pushed herself to the breaking point for roles that demanded everything. But this moment, being torn down in front of an entire set as if she were nothing, felt different. And worse, doubt began to creep in. Maybe she wasn't good enough anymore. Maybe John was right. Maybe she really had lost her shine. The thought coiled in her stomach like a sickness. No. She knew her talent. She knew her worth. And she wouldn't let one man's arrogance strip that away. John clapped his hands, breaking the silence. All right, people, let's go again. Maybe this time, our lead will actually show up. Sandra inhaled sharply. Then she nodded to the assistant director. The cameras rolled. And she threw herself back into the moment. Sandra let the weight of the scene consume her, sinking deeper into her character's pain. This time, her performance felt stronger, richer, more raw. She could feel it in her bones, in the way the energy in the room shifted. And when she hit her final line, she knew. It was perfect. Or so she thought. John's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Sandra looked up, breathless, hopeful. But then she saw his face. That smirk, cold and calculated. Still missing something, he mused. Maybe you should watch some of your old movies. See if you can remember how to act. Laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough people to make her chest tighten. She willed herself to stay still, to keep her breathing steady. But inside, she was breaking. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with an unspoken question: would anyone say anything? Would anyone push back? The crew exchanged glances. Some looked ashamed. Others seemed relieved that, for today, they weren't the target. And then, John delivered the final blow. Leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, he gave her a lazy, almost amused look. Sandra, sweetheart, he drawled, if the next take isn't better, I might have to start thinking about a replacement. Understood? A chill ran down her spine. She knew he wasn't serious. She was the lead, the studio wanted her. But the message was clear. She was replaceable. And no one on set was going to fight for her. She was alone. Or at least, that's what she thought. Because at that moment, the door to the set opened. Sandra turned her head slightly, and that's when she saw him. Keanu Reeves. His presence was quiet but commanding. He didn't say a word, just scanned the room, taking everything in. The tension, the unease, the way the crew avoided looking at Sandra. And from the slight furrow in his brow, it was clear, he understood exactly what was happening. Sandra could already tell. John Hargrove had no idea what was coming next. The tension on set was thick, suffocating. Sandra kept her head down, her fists clenched at her sides, fighting against the humiliation burning in her chest. John sat back in his chair, satisfied, watching the crew scramble to reset the scene. He had made his point. He was in control. No one would dare challenge him. But then, the door to the soundstage swung open. And the power in the room shifted. Keanu Reeves stepped inside. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. His gaze moved slowly across the room, reading it like a script. Keanu had been on countless sets, worked with demanding directors, endured grueling shoots. But this? This was something else. The air was heavy, suffocating. Like everyone was walking on glass, afraid of the next misstep. Like the room itself had been drained of oxygen the moment John opened his mouth. And then there was Sandra. She stood still, unreadable, but he could see it. Something had happened. Something was wrong. John finally noticed him. His smug expression faltered, just for a second. Because Keanu wasn't just another actor. He was Keanu Reeves. An industry veteran. Respected by everyone, even those outside of Hollywood. John quickly masked his surprise, forcing a casual smirk as he stood. Well, he said. The legend himself. Keanu's face remained unreadable. Hey, John. His voice was calm, steady. But there was an edge beneath it. John gestured toward Sandra, his smirk sharpening. You're just in time to see your co-star in action. Or, a pause, a deliberate smirk, at least, trying to. A few crew members stiffened. Sandra didn't react. But Keanu, his eyes narrowed. Just slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. A flicker of something dangerous. The kind of look that made people rethink their words before they said them. John either didn't notice, or worse, he didn't care. Clapping his hands, he turned back to the crew. All right, let's reset. I want a better take this time. Then, with mock encouragement, he glanced at Sandra. Unless you think you need a break. A challenge. A dare. Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but she didn't have to. Keanu beat her to it. How about we take a minute? The set went silent. John turned, his smirk slipping. Excuse me. Keanu's gaze stayed locked on him. A break, he repeated, his tone even. You've been running the scene back to back. I think we could all use one. John let out a small, amused laugh. We don't have time for that, he said, waving a dismissive hand. We're already behind schedule. Keanu tilted his head slightly. So maybe pushing people to the breaking point isn't the best strategy. A few crew members exchanged quick glances. It wasn't loud. It wasn't an attack. But it was enough. A crack in John's undisputed authority. John's smile tightened. I appreciate the concern, he said, his voice smooth, controlled. But I know how to run my set. Keanu didn't blink. Yeah. A beat. Then, with perfectly measured calm, he said. Because from what I'm seeing, it looks more like you're running people into the ground. The entire crew froze. Sandra's breath caught. Keanu wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't arguing. But there was power in the way he spoke. A controlled defiance. And for the first time, John Hargrove looked unsettled. He forced out a laugh, but his body was tense. He wasn't used to being questioned. Not like this. Not in front of his own crew. And now, Keanu Reeves stood between him and his authority. The question hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Was John really going to challenge him? Or was he about to lose control of his own set? Every eye was locked on them, every breath held. John and Keanu stood at a silent impasse, the tension crackling like a live wire. No one had ever done this before. No one had ever openly challenged John Hargrove in front of his own team. And now Keanu had done it, with quiet, surgical precision. No yelling. No theatrics. Just the truth. And John. He didn't like it. Not one bit. His jaw clenched, his tight smile barely concealing the anger beneath. "I appreciate the concern, Keanu," he said, his voice controlled, forced. "But let's be clear. I run this set. Not you." Keanu didn't flinch. "Then start acting like it." A ripple of shock passed through the crew. Even Sandra's breath caught. John's expression darkened. "Excuse me." Keanu tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "You think breaking people down makes them perform better?" His tone was steady. Unshaken. "All I see," Mark Levinson didn't blink. "You push your actors," he repeated, flipping the page in front of him. "Or you push them away." John scoffed. "Oh, please. You're going to sit here and tell me that great directors don't demand excellence?" Mark exhaled, adjusting his glasses. "Excellence isn't the issue, John. The issue is how you go about getting it." The room was deadly silent. Sandra remained still, her arms crossed. Keanu sat beside her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken yet, but his presence alone was enough to make John shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You have no idea the pressure I'm under," John continued, his voice sharp. "Studios breathe down my neck, expecting perfection. If I don't push, I don't get results. And if I don't get results, the film suffers." Sandra finally spoke. "No," she said. "The film suffers when people are too afraid to do their best." John's head snapped toward her. "Oh, don't act like you're some kind of martyr, Sandra." Keanu leaned forward slightly, just enough to make John hesitate. Mark cleared his throat, drawing the attention back to him. "John, let me be clear," he said. "We've had complaints about your methods before. But this?" He gestured to the report in front of him. "This is different. You had key members of the cast and crew ready to walk off set. Do you understand how serious that is?" John's jaw tightened. "So what? You're firing me?" Mark studied him. "We're considering our options." John laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "All because a bunch of soft actors and crew members can't handle a little pressure." Keanu's voice cut through the room like steel. "You call it pressure?" His eyes were locked on John, unwavering. "I call it abuse." Silence. Sandra saw it then. The shift. John wasn't winning this fight. Mark tapped his fingers against the table. "The studio has a decision to make," he said finally. "And John, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that you won't like it." John's face darkened. "This is my film," he said through clenched teeth. Mark's expression was unreadable. "Not anymore, it isn't." The words hit like a hammer. John's entire body tensed. His fingers curled into fists against the table, his face paling. "You can't be serious," he said. Mark leaned forward. "The studio isn't in the business of burning bridges," he said. "But we are in the business of protecting our productions. And right now, you're a liability." John opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he looked truly lost. Like a man realizing too late that he'd bet everything on the wrong hand. Mark stood. "We'll be in touch with our decision soon." The meeting was over. Sandra and Keanu stood as well, not waiting for John to react. As they turned to leave, Sandra hesitated just for a second, then looked back. John was still sitting there, staring at the table, silent. And for the first time since she'd known him, he looked small. The power he had wielded for so long was slipping through his fingers. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Without another word, Sandra walked out. Keanu followed. And the door closed behind them. Sandra ran her fingers over the script's cover, feeling the weight of possibility in her hands. She glanced up at Keanu, who was watching her with that quiet, patient gaze of his. The kind that never pressured, never pushed, just let things unfold. "You really think this one's special?" she asked. Keanu nodded. "Yeah. I do." Sandra smirked. "You've said that before." His lips quirked into a smile. "And was I wrong?" She thought back to their past projects, the risks they had taken, the magic they had created together. "No," she admitted. "You never are." She looked back down at the script, flipping through the first few pages. The dialogue was sharp, the characters layered. But more than that, it felt right. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't dreading the next step. She was excited for it. Sandra closed the folder and exhaled. "All right," she said, meeting his gaze. "Let's do it." Keanu grinned. And just like that, a new chapter began. Epilogue. Months later, the film they had fought so hard to make finally premiered. The press had speculated endlessly about the behind-the-scenes turmoil, about John Hargrove's near fall from grace. But when the film hit the screen, none of that mattered. The performances were breathtaking. The cinematography flawless. The storytelling raw and real. The audience sat spellbound, caught up in a world that had nearly crumbled before it was even fully built. And at the end, as the credits rolled, a quiet moment passed between Sandra and Keanu. They had been through hell to get here. And it had been worth every second. As they walked out of the theater, past the flashing cameras and eager reporters, Sandra turned to Keanu. "We should celebrate," she said. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Dinner or motorcycles?" Sandra laughed. "Why not both?" He chuckled. "You're on." And as they disappeared into the night, the city lights glimmering around them, one thing was clear. This wasn't just the end of a film. It was the beginning of something new.